I first want to start off by acknowledging that Councilmember Jawando could not be here because his grandfather on his wife's side did pass away at the age of 93. They're in New York right now for his homegoing celebration. And it really is a part of the tradition in our Black community that we honor our folks that have passed. And while Councilmember Jawando wanted to be here, he is celebrating the Black history and the legacy of what Michelle's grandfather certainly meant to their family and to their children. And so I just ask that we keep him and his family in our thoughts and prayers. Let me talk about Black history from my perspective, because, you know, it's one in which every single year when we think about what we want this program to be, I'm always reminded of the history and what that history means for us in our community. But I was listening to something on the radio as I was coming in, and it reminded me that Black history is created every single day, every single moment. You know, the fact of Councilmember Jawando and I actually being a part of this council is Black history. It's the first time we've had two Black men serve on the Montgomery County Council. Councilmember Jawando is only the fourth Black person to serve on the Montgomery County Council. As I start to give you those history numbers and you say to yourself, we're in 2019, and I continue to tell you about history, it says something about how far we still need to go if we are truly talking about equity and equality in our communities. We continue to celebrate firsts every day, and that says something. It says something about the rich history of racism that has limited folks from being able to achieve and accomplish the very things that so many of us take for granted. It's one in which, you know, and it's interesting, as my faith is deeply rooted from the South, my mother continues to remind me that while she struggled to be able to be seen as an equal, she never let that dampen her spirit for understanding that we as a people need to be together. We need to be one as a community, and there is no separation between us. I was reminded of that on my travels to Ethiopia just a few weeks ago, where across the world, some of the number one things that they were teaching children in a school that had dirt on the floor as their classrooms, and they went to bathrooms in an outhouse with a hole in the ground. We're learning algebra and talking about equality and equity and taking care of your fellow man. It's something that, again, reminds me that why is it that the United States of America invests and does business with so many other foreign countries and continents, but doesn't do much when it comes to Africa? I've never seen us talk about economic development opportunities in Africa with our Black brothers and sisters. And I say there's so much more that needs to be done. There's Black history to be made in terms of forging relationships across the globe and ensuring that if we talk the game of having one people, that we actually truly live out that spirit of one people, one world. And so I look forward to this day. This is not doom and gloom. It's one in which it just says that we have work to do. And so I look forward to continuing to roll up my sleeves, but not to be silent. Because if we're not talking about these things that we know are still important to us, that still are challenges that keep us from getting to that objective that we want to be, which is having us together as one world, as one people, we have to make sure that we're knocking down some of those barriers. And so I'm I'm looking forward to the presentation today, especially to hear from our young people, to hear from them about what they see on the horizon and the future, what they see is the potential for us in terms of what we as a world can become and how we together can make this an even better place for all, and know that all folks will eventually have the ability to be successful and truly live in a world of equality. I was inspired by the conversation that we need to get uncomfortable. So let me remind people of where we are right now and what's happened in this past week. In this past week, we've had a person that says that the KKK needs to ride again, in response to what is happening with some state legislators in a state who are trying to move forward the very things that we talk about we need to do in terms of progress. Just yesterday, a delegate in the Maryland General Assembly was quoted as using the N-word in describing a district that she door knocked on in Prince George's County. These things are happening now. Flyers are being disseminated throughout the state of Maryland as well as around the United States, continuing to say that white supremacy needs to be the rule of the land. This is where we are now. Black history tells us about the stories about what happened when those things were allowed to exist in our communities and what it meant and the suffering that it meant for black people in the United States of America. I encourage people, because this is Black History Month, to find out their own history. I actually went to one of the DNA sites and sent in my DNA and found out a lot about my family that I didn't know. My grandfather, I always wondered, I knew that my grandfather had married twice, and I'd always thought to myself, well, you know, what had happened with that was, you know, divorce wasn't big back then, and found out that his wife actually his first wife had died in childbirth. And he was then brought into another family. And I said, well, I don't understand. Why is he living with this family, the Mott family, in South Carolina? And found out through doing some more research through this website that my grandfather's parents were actually burned alive by the Ku Klux Klan. These stories aren't that far from us when you talk about those 55 years of history. And the key is that because they're not that far from us, they can come back if we aren't intentional about saying this is not us. We only have to look at what happened just down south, a few states, where a person took their car and rammed it through people who were saying that we want people to be seen as equal, killing and maiming people for the sake of the preservation of elitism. That's happening now. And if we aren't vocal about what we need to do and that we are not accepting of this at every single realm, this isn't just about us saying, well, it's not okay to do these kinds of things. We need to be intentional and forthright about saying that these are not accepted in our community. We need to be strong in our voice and united that this is not us. Because I fear that if we're not strong in terms of saying those things and making sure that people understand that these are not accepted, we will easily slip back into this dark past that we saw. We are not that far away, folks. We are not that far away. And so I just encourage folks, again, to talk to your families, learn about your history, but more importantly, crusade for a better place. Because I can tell you that every time I read stories like this that continue to happen in 2019, we can talk about 55 years ago and what happened with the Civil Rights Act and all of those kinds of things. But if it hasn't changed what's happening in terms of people still being murdered and people still being marginalized and discriminated against today, we haven't gone anywhere.